Okay, can anyone see or hear this? Sorry, I'm just doing a couple of checks just now to make sure that everything's working. Okay. Okay, so I've been informed that this is working. Sorry, just checking a couple of things. Start. Okay, so I'm just going to make a start on this. If any of you have any questions or anything while I'm talking, feel free to comment on the live chat, which I have access to here. Similarly, if there's any problems with the sound or picture quality at any times, or if the screen starts stuttering or anything drops off, then please do just tell me by commenting on the live chat. Also, first thing to say is that this video will be, once the stream is finished, going up on the ORCOM Scotland Facebook page. So that's the same Facebook page that you're on here. And so you can review it or watch it or anything else like that. Additionally, if any of you have any questions on anything I've said, then you can feel free to just message me. You can contact me on Facebook. My name's Owen Mooney on Facebook, just as it's spelled in the title of this stream. Or if you can't get hold of me there, feel free to just message or get in contact with the ORCOM Scotland themselves, and they'll be able to pass my details on to you. Okay, cool. So the workshop I'm doing here is called Effective Rebuttal. This is based on some workshops I've already given to both training at Glasgow University, which is where I'm from and where I speak for, and for, I think it was Delft and a couple of other societies that I've done this for online. There's a few things to say about rebuttal. Basically, I'm going to structure this into, I'm going to break this down roughly into 3 areas. The first is, why do we rebut things? A sort of general introduction to the concept. Secondly is specifically how to rebut in terms of breaking down arguments. And thirdly then is the question of weighing comparatives, which is important to, thanks for the compliments, which is important to, which is something that's important as well. Okay, so to get right into it, the first question is, why do we do rebuttal? Like, why do we bother rebutting at all? I mean, obviously the short answer to this is because it's a debate, and that's what we do in debates. But you should always be thinking, when you're rebutting arguments, why are you rebutting this? Why is it necessary for your case to work in order to rebut this? For example, if you've run an extension that's very off the wall and distinctive from anything else that's happened in the debate, it may well not be necessary to rebut or respond to random pieces of analysis that were thrown out in the top half. You should only really be rebutting arguments, and you should be identifying and prioritizing what arguments to rebut according to how likely you think those arguments are to either, one, win the debate for opposing teams, or two, severely problematize any arguments that you or your teammates might be wanting to run. A very common mistake when doing rebuttal is to do too much of it. So this is particularly a problem for extension speakers, where it's not uncommon to see an extension speaker spend 4.5, 5 minutes on rebuttal, leaving them with not enough time to get out an extension. This can similarly be a problem for DPM or DLO speakers. So it's important to be disciplined with yourself when thinking about, why am I rebutting this argument? Is it necessary to rebut, or am I just doing it to fill time or anything like that? So that's sort of the first thing to say, and the first thing to bear in mind. The question in terms then of what to rebut, how to identify arguments in order to rebut, like, I could probably run a whole workshop on this entirely, and it's not really going to be the focus of what I'm doing here, which is going to be much more based on the question of how you go about actually doing it. But the short answer is, think about it from their case from the perspective of a judge. Ideally, what arguments are you currently crediting them with? What arguments do you think they haven't quite fully made? And what arguments, if any, are they likely to be winning the debate with? And you should be prioritizing, focusing your rebuttal on those arguments or portions of their case which could conceivably win the debate, and deprioritizing or even ignoring entirely arguments which you don't think could win them the debate, or which you think they are completely irrelevant or whatever. The one exception to this rule sort of is if you think that there is an argument which potentially sounds important, but they haven't quite made it, so perhaps not explained all of the logical or analytical steps, it can be useful to just very quickly point this out in a couple of sentences. Similarly, if they've made an argument which you can, whilst it might not be the most important thing in a debate, you can rebut very quickly in a manner that would make them look silly almost for making the claim. It can be useful to sort of do this just to sort of make it very obvious to the judges that you're in control of the debate, that you've that your case is significantly better than theirs. It just sort of it can be quite useful as a means of damaging the credibility of teams, which can always be something that can factor into judges' minds when they're weighing up calls at the end of the debate. Okay, on to the meat of what we'll be talking about here, which is the question of how do you actually go about doing rebuttal? How do you effectively rebut arguments? So the first thing that I think it's really important to understand, and I think is the most common mistake I see debaters at all skill levels making, is confusing rebutting an argument with simply responding to it. So I'm going to give you the difference is basically this. A response to an argument is any sort of claim, statement, or argument of your own which contradicts or seeks to minimize the impact or is in some way mutually exclusive with the initial argument that's been offered. Whereas rebuttal is attacking specifically the underlying logic of an argument that's been offered such that it no longer stands on its own. I'll give you probably quite a silly example to illustrate the difference. If I say in a debate, if I'm OG, and I say that the sky is green, a response to this would be to say, for Op to stand up and say, no, that's obviously silly, the sky is blue. Now, that's a response insofar as the sky can't be both green and blue. It has to be one or the other. And you might even think it's an effective response. If you're the judge, you'll be sitting there going, yeah, it's obviously blue. But it's not rebuttal insofar as the initial response is still standing, insofar as the initial claim is still standing. The way you can sort of think about this and think about the difference is, could you respond to the response by just restating the first claim? And in this question there, you actually could. So if OG say the sky is green, LO says, no, it's blue, DPM says, no, it's green, then the DPM has also responded to the LO. So now, this obviously doesn't enter the question of whether or not these are convincing or good responses, but it's just to sort of illustrate the difference. To give you a more relevant or useful example that might actually come up in the debate, let's say on the motion, this House believes that states should prioritize economic growth over economic equality within their states. So that's a very common debate you might see, and it's also a clash which is a relevant aspect of many, many debates. We all very often are asked to trade off a bit more economic growth or prosperity for a bit more fairness. So if OG is making the claim that says, we think that we should prioritize economic growth is more important because it makes people happier. Our response from LO might be to say, no, economic growth isn't what makes people happier. Fairness makes people happy. And we know this is true because societies which are more equal, such as Scandinavia, have shown themselves to be much happier. So that would be an example of a response, potentially a good response, depending on how much additional analysis you add to that claim, potentially even a very good response that could win you the clash. What it doesn't do, however, is rebut the underlying argument, because the underlying argument or the underlying claim from OG still stands. A way you could rebut it then, rather than merely responding to it, would be to say, for example, no, economic growth doesn't necessarily make people happier. We know this is the case because as people acquire more and more things, they tend to they can just become greedy and dissatisfied with what they have. So you become pressured to work longer and harder hours to acquire more and more possessions, which in the end doesn't serve to make you happier and in fact means you're missing out on all the life. So that would be an example of rebuttal because it's rebutting the initial underlying claim. So how then do you, and there's something that I think is important to bear in mind and that I'll refer back to at various times during the workshop. I think it's important to note that sometimes a response is sufficient. The sky is green case, you probably wouldn't want to waste time actually rebutting the underlying logic as to why the sky couldn't be green. But sometimes it can be very useful to rebut as opposed to merely responding to an argument. So how then do we actually go about rebutting or breaking down arguments? The first thing to understand here is in order to rebut an argument, you need to understand very clearly why it is that how it is that the argument is made, or how it is that arguments in general are made. So there's incredibly useful here is good note taking. This is incredibly important if you're a sum speaker or if you're a second speaker whose main job is to respond to arguments that have been made. It's very important that you note down exactly how it is that teams are making these arguments in order that you can then rebut specific links. Because if you, often the way, and I'll go on to talk about this a bit more in a second, but often the way you are rebutting arguments is by breaking down specific individual analytical links, as opposed to just trying to rebut the conclusion of the argument as a whole. So it's important to have good note-taking skills and to be careful about making sure you're responding to the links that are given, as opposed to how that argument is commonly expressed, or how you've heard that argument be made before, or how you think the argument could have been made. Okay, so there's sort of four, you'll all have done, I'm sure everyone who's watching this will have at least some experience with debating and will have at least done some training as to the basic structure of arguments. But just to sort of give a review and in a way that I think is useful for understanding how to break them down. So there's sort of four main parts that go into an argument. The first is a claim. So this is just whatever your initial claim is. For example, fairness is more important than economic growth. So for example, economic fairness makes people happy. So that would be an initial claim. The second part then is analysis. That's explaining your claim, and this is the bulk of any argumentation. So you might say, for example, one of the ways so fairness economic fairness is important because it makes people happier. This is because in societies that are very unfair, people are often jealous of each other, or people are often unhappy due to being poor, or are struggling to compete and get ahead of each other. And if there was more economic equality, people would be happier. That would be an example of analysis. I'm not saying this is necessarily particularly good analysis. It's just for the sake of doing this. The third thing then that is part of arguments is examples. So to continue with this one I'm using, you could say, for example, societies such as Scandinavia, which have far more economic equality, are generally happier or generally have less social discontent than extremely unequal societies like the United States. So an example would be the third part, and then the fourth part of the fourth important part of any argument is the impact. Is why are you making this argument? Why is this argument relative to the debate? So for this one, it could be as simple as saying, and we think happiness in society is important because it's just a consequential good in and of itself, but also because when people in society are happy, they're less likely to do things. They're less likely to do things like commit crime. They're more likely to pay their taxes. They're less likely to be hostile or resentful to immigrants or other outgroups in a society. So that's the sort of four basic parts of an argument, which is the initial claim, the underlying analysis, the examples or characterizations that are given, and the impact of the argument. So you can rebut or begin to rebut this argument at any one of these four stages. So I'll go through each of the four stages in order and explain how it is that you'd rebut any of these. Then after this, I'll talk about which is the most important to rebut, or which is the most important part of it, which is the best way to do this. So rebutting an initial underlying claim is pretty straightforward. It can just be a very straightforward matter of contradiction. So to continue with the example I've been using, economic fairness is important because it makes people happy. You can rebut this underlying claim by simply saying, no, that isn't true. In fact, it makes people less happy. Would be rebuttal, or you can say it would just be contradiction, or you can say, for example, sure, it might be one thing, or you can say this might have some effect, but it's not very relevant. There's lots of other factors that control much more whether people are happy or unhappy, such as whether or not there's crime in their neighborhood, if they have good housing, if they have jobs, if they have decent public services, as opposed to just equality, a whole array of things, which you can say. So dealing with an initial claim is the most straightforward part, and if you're going to rebut any argument, you will probably have to at least disagree with it in order to do so. Rebutting the analytical links then is the second part. So this is looking at what are the specific analytical links which are given, and to go about breaking those down. So I think the analytical link I gave was in the argument I was talking about here, was that when there is more economic equality, people are less jealous of each other, and this makes them happy. Now, you can go about rebutting this analytical link by pointing out that perhaps it might not be the case that people are extremely jealous of people with more wealth than them. Often it might be the case, if you look to the examples of concepts like the American dream, where in fact this is taken as an inspiration, as a drive for you to work harder, where the rich are held up as something to be admired, as success stories, as people you can aspire to be, as opposed to enemies or people you should dislike or be jealous of. So that would be an example of how you can go about responding to the analytical link. It's saying, okay, the argument they've given is X. This is the analytical link they gave to prove that X is true. I'm going to show you that this link is untrue or doesn't work or doesn't apply in this context, any one of a number of things. And this is usually the most effective way to rebut or break down an argument, because if you're able to rebut on all of their analytical links, then they haven't proven that the claim is true, so the argument doesn't stand. Thirdly, examples. The way you rebut an example is usually by pointing out that the example might be disanalogous or irrelevant to the situation we're talking about. So you might say they claim that Scandinavian countries are much happier because of their high socioeconomic equality. In fact, this is due to a whole host of other circumstances. So I don't know, strong cultural traditions, or good public services, or a good family structure, whatever, any one of a number of things. That's usually the least important or the worst way to rebut an argument, is to simply deal with the example, because all an example is doing in an argument is adding some context or some color or some character to it to make it easier to understand. So even if it's not, the argument itself usually doesn't rely on the example. So even if you point out it might not be the case that Scandinavians are happier, or it could be for other reasons, if all of their analytical links and their initial claim still stands, then you haven't rebutted that argument. All you've done is rebut the example. Now, sometimes that can be useful. Sometimes if an argument relies on a very, very specific example, or if the analysis is kind of weak and they're relying on the example, and the example is more an intuitive one to sort of try and carry the judges with them, then it can be useful to rebut the example. But in the vast majority of cases, it is better to be rebutting the analytical links as opposed to focusing on the examples. The fourth part then, impacting. How do you rebut an impact? So there's a couple of different ways. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this, and I'll go on to talk about this more when in the second part of the workshop, when I talk about weighing arguments or trading arguments off against each other. But usually the way you rebut an impact is to say, okay, true, this argument might be true, but we just don't think it's particularly important. So in this example, where people are saying that the impact of happiness is important because it's relevant, and the impact of happiness is that it's a consequential good and that it helps people to stop committing crimes or pay their taxes if they feel happy with the society that they're in, is to say, yeah, okay, sure, that all of this argument might be true, but we just don't think that a little bit of happiness that you get here is particularly important in the grand scheme of things. We don't think that that should be the purpose of what the state does necessarily. We think sure, reducing crime might be important, but we think there are other more important issues. We think a more effective way to reduce crime might be by increasing economic growth, because if everyone has all the material goods that they need, then there's no need for them to go out and steal anymore. So that would be a way of how you might go about rebutting the impact of the argument. It's to essentially concede that the argument is true, or is true up to a point, but simply that it doesn't matter, or that there are better ways of attaining the impacts, or there are other more important or relevant things. So those are the sort of four ways. It's the claim, which you deal with simply by contradicting or offering an alternative claim. The analysis, which you deal with by explaining why those analytical links that are given don't follow. Examples, which you can deal with by explaining that they're disanalogous or irrelevant or don't apply in this context. Or the impact, which you can deal with by explaining that it is that the impact is not important, or that it is outweighed by other things in the debate. So those are broadly the four ways that you can go about rebutting or breaking down arguments that teams make. So the question that commonly gets asked about this is, which is the best of these to do? That is, if you're sitting there in closing up sum, you have all your rebuttal to OG ready to go. CG gives their extension, and you're like, right, I've only got 2 minutes left in my speech or whatever to rebut this, so I only have time to do one of these things properly. Which is the one I should do? Now, as with all things in debating, the answer is it depends. Sometimes it will be the rebutting the analysis, sometimes it'll be weighing the impact. This is just a matter of your own judgment, and it's something that I think you should experiment with in training or in different types of debates, seeing whether or not it's more effective to concede the truth of arguments but argue they're not important, or whether it's better to go about breaking down the argument as a whole and showing that it doesn't work. In general, it is always better to focus on rebutting the analysis or the impact, because as I sort of said already, rebutting an example often doesn't do very much to damage the strength of the argument as a whole. And simply contradicting the claim is usually not going to be sufficient, as in, unless the argument that's been made is incredibly weak or incredibly poorly explained, and if you're facing off against teams of equivalent skill level to yourself, then usually simply contradicting a claim won't pass, as in usually there will be at least some, and depending on the strength of the team, at least some analytical claims that have been proven to be true and that require dealing with. So the question then is really a case of whether it's whether it's better in a situation to rebut the underlying analysis or to deal with the impact. So Again, I think in general, it is always better if you can rebut the underlying analytical links, because the reason for this is because if you're able to do this completely, so if you can completely take out every single link that a team's offered for an argument, then that argument should carry no weight at all in the judge's decision, if you've completely taken it out. Whereas if you are conceding the truth of an argument, but just arguing that the impact isn't quite so important or whatever, then that still carries some weight in the judge's decision, even though it might carry less weight. Now, it might not always be possible to rebut every analytical link. Usually, if you're up against very, very good teams, then usually there will be at least some analytical links that just stand. It's also just the case that in debating, like, the reason a motion is good and will be set at a European Championship is because it's balanced. That is, there's arguments on both sides. So usually there are some arguments made that it will just not be possible to rebut. So for example, I think it is impossible to prove that economic equality has no bearing whatsoever on how happy or how content a society is. So I think it would be very, very difficult to completely break down that argument, whereas it is very, very possible to effectively minimize or mitigate. Like, say, sure, it has some, but that might not be very large. And you might find it much, much easier to simply mitigate and then weigh it off against your own material. Another reason it can be useful to weigh off the impact almost is if you have enough time to do both. So that is to say, give all your responses to the analytical links and then say, but even if this were true, even if they had proven the argument, we still think our material is more important because X, Y, Z. This is what's known as taking your opponents at their highest burden, or taking them at their highest. And it can be a particularly useful thing to do if you're in the top half. So if you're in one of the opening government or opening opposition teams. And the reason it's particularly useful in this situation is because if you're in opening up and you respond to every single analytical link OG gives, so you've completely taken out all of OG's arguments, CG could come along and give a whole new series of analytical links that you obviously don't have any chance to respond to, and then could then still win the debate on that argument. Whereas if you've rebutted the analytical links and then also managed to minimize the impacts or explain why the impact of the argument means it's less important than your material, then even if CG do provide new analytical links, you still have some weight in this clash against them. So all your mitigation or all your weighing should still stand, can still be useful in weighing up that clash. So yeah, that is the question of which is the best one to do. Okay. What's next? Yes, okay. 2 miscellaneous things to talk about here before I move on to the second part of the workshop. The first one is the first one I covered slightly already, which is good note-taking skills. Actually, no. So I'll talk about it in a second. So the first one then is just very quickly on chains of arguments. So what I mean by chains of arguments is when several arguments or several different impacts are all come one after the other, but each one is dependent on the one that came before it, or dependent against earlier arguments made. So to give an example of this, I'll give an example from a debate I was in recently. So the motion is, this House believes that the African Union should introduce a common currency, so similar to the euro. We were opening opposition. And so one of our initial arguments went with any common currency between diverse economies is always going to fail because they all have their own differing needs as to at what level that currency should be set. So trying to pick a common one means that for some countries it's set too high, for other countries it's set too low, and this economically harms all countries within it. So that's one distinct argument, and there are harms that flow from this, and that can stand entirely on itself. We then went on to make a second argument, which is, as a function of economic tension and of arguing over what level the currency should be set at, this creates political tensions, which makes it more likely that countries will leave the union, or makes it harder for the union to come together to respond to certain issues, such as pressing security threats or humanitarian issues or whatever. So that's an example of 2 arguments that are distinct. They both have their own impacts, they're both clearly separate. But the second argument is actually contingent or dependent on the first. So because we've said the reason why you're having political tensions is because of this kerfuffle over the currency. So it's in fact dependent on the first argument. So if a team is able to rebut the first argument, then the second one also falls. So if a team was able to say, actually, no, a common currency is great and never caused any of these problems, and somehow explain that or somehow prove that, then the second argument also falls. Or if they're able to rebut all of the links we've given as to why a common currency creates economic difficulties, then again, that would be sufficient to bring down all of the impacts we've then attached to it. So that's what I mean by a chain of argument, by chains of arguments. And it's important to look out for these when you're first of all, yourself in your own prep, to be aware of when you're making these and be aware of when it can be vulnerable and where you might want to add additional links so that your arguments aren't all dependent on each other. But also when opposing teams are making these arguments, because then you can very, very effectively rebut often an entire speech or an entire two speeches by dealing with a very few links that were given very early on in the first speech. So if you do notice an opportunity to do this, it's very important that you fully explain how each argument, why each argument is dependent on the one before it, and then how it all falls. So rather than just say in that context, and we've shown why there, so XYZ, here's some analysis, and we've shown why there is no economic instability created by a common currency, therefore their whole case is irrelevant. It's important to actually explain why that makes, why each chain then falls. So say, blah, 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 here's some analysis. So we've shown that this doesn't create economic instability. So all of the harms they've attached to economic instability don't weigh in this debate. But additionally, this also means that the political stability they want to talk about doesn't happen, because if there's no economic instability, then this doesn't cause any of the political instability. So again, all of the harms they've attached to political instability don't happen either, or don't occur either. And that's so that's what I mean by chains of arguments and sort of fully explaining it. Yeah. Okay, the note-taking skills I talked about already. This is particularly important with lengthy or complex or involved arguments, but just I've covered that already. It's just something to bear in mind. Okay, secondly then, and lastly, I'm moving on to weighing of arguments. Sorry, second. Yeah, there we go. Okay, this section will be probably a bit shorter than the first I just talked about. Okay, so weighing arguments. Now, the reason I'm talking about this here and talking about it as part of effective rebuttal is because it is very, very rare when you're facing off against teams who are at the same skill level as yourself, which, because competitions are power paired, and particularly over long competitions like Euros or Worlds, you're very, very likely to be continually hitting teams who are exactly as good as you. It is very, very rare that you will be able to completely rebut every argument they make or completely remove every single individual analytical link that they can do. If you can do it, all power to you, but just sometimes and in some motions, this will just never be possible. So always then, what you're going to end up with, almost always then, you'll be ended up with a situation in which you've proven some things, the other team has proven some other things, and you need to then weigh these things up to say why one thing should be considered more important, or why your thing wins the debate and matters more than their thing. So this is what's known as, so this is what I mean by weighing comparatives. Okay, so or weighing arguments, probably a better explanation of it. So broadly, how then do you go about weighing? There's a few different ways to do this, and I don't want to be too prescriptive with this. There are, however, there's a few common patterns that I think this usually falls into when you're weighing impacts. So usually when you're weighing impacts up against each other. So that is to say you're not weighing the quality of analytical links. Like, you're not saying our analysis was better, therefore it beats them. I mean, judges might sometimes call debates that way, but in general, it shouldn't be, and it should be decided upon on what the impact of an argument is, particularly if they're equally well explained. So there's a few different ways that one can weigh up impacts. So yeah, the first is the relative size of an impact. So for example, when we're asking the question which is worse, killing someone or punching someone? The answer is killing someone is probably worse because that is a greater size of impact, that more harm is done. Therefore, you should consider this to be more important. So that's the easiest and most straightforward way to weigh up an impact. The second way that can be very straightforward is numbers. So which is worse, punching 50 people or punching one person? Again, you'd probably say punching 50 people is worse because that's 50 times as many people are suffering the harm. And that's a second way that's very sort of obvious or straightforward to weigh up impacts. And like usually or a lot of the time, in debates that are heavily consequential, some combination of that is often enough to do that. So if we're taking an IR debate, for example, where we're saying, I don't know, this House regrets the decision of the West not to invade Syria. Usually what you are doing there, or very often what that debate can come down to, is which side is proving more dead people. Like, obviously you're not putting exact numbers on this, but in general, that will often be a very powerful metric that can win or lose debates. Or if, for example, you're doing a motion on, what would a good motion be? Yeah, okay. If, for example, you're doing a motion on this House would trade off this House supports global communism, a motion that's relatively often set. You can do weighing, like a very common weighing of, in terms of the size of impact, is to say, okay, yeah, sure, this might be a world that's poorer, but a poorer world is still preferable to one where some people don't have enough food or enough medicine or enough good or enough stuff they need to live or whatever. So, where some people literally don't have enough. So the impact of everyone having a bit less money is lesser than the impact of a few people having nothing at all. So some combination of both of these is usually what I think a lot of debates do come down to. The third way, though, that's by far I think the most interesting and is the most difficult to do in terms of weighing is the question of what is the more morally relevant or impact. So this very, very often is the way in which you weigh up debates where lots of different impacts have been proven true, and it's actually quite difficult to decide just which is the larger of the impact or which more people are involved, particularly given that you can't use numbers or charts in debating, so you often can't prove a number of these things. So what I mean by which is the more morally relevant or morally significant impact is, again, to give a sort of example, which is worse, to punch an adult or to punch a child? And usually most people intuitively would say probably punching the child is worse. And the reason for that, assuming you're doing equal harm to both the adult and the child, the reason for that is because we think because children are more vulnerable or whatever, we tend to place a higher moral significance on harm done to children than on harm done to adults. So that's one quite specific example. There's other examples we could think of in this context. And this is a very, very common way of weighing that's often it's often framed as which is the more vulnerable group. So for example, a very common one is to say that we should care more about harm done to immigrants or done to refugees, precisely because these are groups which face structural and systemic racism and discrimination. That means principally harms visited on them are worse than harms visited upon everyone else. So, but I think as well it can go. So that would be a very, very common way of trying to weigh up one impact as being more important than another. This is particularly true if you've given an extension or a case that focuses specifically on harm done to one group. So in the context of a debate on aid or whatever, why this motion might be particularly beneficial for women, a very effective way then of weighing this, rather than just trying to do it in a crude consequential term, is to say we should care more about these benefits because we owe a particular duty to compensate women additionally for harm suffered under patriarchy or whatever. So vulnerability is how it's most often expressed, but I think it can go much broader than that, and there's a lot of other ways in which you can think about this. So probably the most extremely intuitive one that we'd probably all agree with is the question of guilt. So that is to say, which is worse, like punching a murderer or punching an innocent person? Again, you intuitively say the murderer just because they've done more wrong things. We consider that person to be, we consider harm to that person to be less morally egregious than harm done to anyone else. So the question of guilt or culpability can be extremely relevant in determining or weighing up impacts. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. None springs to mind immediately, but very commonly in debates about law and justice, or debates about various other things. Yeah, it would actually, it's a very standard justification for high taxes on the rich, is to say that because the rich have benefit from the society we set up and the status quo that we set up, they have a growth, all that sort of stuff. So that's what I mean by the moral worth of weighing up, and I think it's a much more interesting. It's, I think, the most interesting and the most skill intensive way of trying to weigh up between sort of varying different impacts. So to sort of bring this back in then to rebuttal and effectively rebutting arguments. Normally, you do your weighing at the end of your rebuttal. So that is to say, you have two choices. You can either weigh the proposition arguments against your own team's arguments or whatever, and sure, that might be fine if your partner's really crushed it in extension, then that might be sufficient for you to win the debate on. But most of the time, it's not. So most of the time, what you want to do is do your rebuttal first, so that you're comparing a mitigated or a reduced version of proposition's case, or of the other team's case, with your own. So that's how you will then usually combine the two. So you'll list, say, the 3 or 4 arguments or whatever that they've made. Go through, think, okay, which ones am I able to disprove analytically? Can I show these arguments don't function at all? Let's say you can do that with 1 or 2 of them. The question then is, okay, they have another couple. Your job then turns to saying, how do I go about proving that these are less important or less relevant than my own partner's material, or the case, or the stuff that my own partner's brought? And you'll usually then do that by going through the impacts that you have, or the principles you have, and explaining why these are larger impacts, more morally relevant impacts, or more important principles or whatever. So that's usually the best way, and so that's usually that is usually going to be the most effective way to respond or to rebut cases like that. Usually all judging will come down to some sort of combination of how good analytically are the teams, so how persuasive do I find the arguments in and of themselves, then which are assuming arguments are similarly persuasive or are all persuasive to at least some degree, which are the greatest or most important impacts, and you put yourself in the best position to win a debate or to stand a win by making sure that you are doing as much as possible to damage the analysis of your opponents so they look analytically weaker, and then doing as much as possible to ensure that your impacts carry the largest weight in the debate, or are viewed as more important, or are viewed as more important in the debate. So yeah, I think that's actually largely what I'm wanting to cover here. There probably is, like, I could say on obviously a lot of these topics, and I think there's potentially more examples I could give, but I don't think it's that useful to sort of go on talking for hours and hours about this. This would be a good time, I guess, if anyone watching has any particular questions. Sorry, just check my notes. I'm just going to check my notes to make sure I've not missed anything. No, yeah. So just to recap then on, just to briefly recap then on what I've covered so far, is one, first of all, to make sure you're conscious of the difference between rebuttal and response. Always be thinking to yourself, am I proving their argument, or am I simply contradicting or presenting an alternative argument myself? And just being aware of not sort of tricking yourself into thinking you're doing one where you're in fact doing the other. Secondly, make sure to be aware of the structure of how an argument is put together in terms of the claim, the underlying claim, analysis that follows to prove it, examples given, or the impacts of arguments. Remember how to break these down. So that is by contradicting or offering an alternative claim, by explaining how individual pieces of analysis don't work or don't follow, by showing how examples are disanalogous or irrelevant, and by showing how impacts are are lesser than what have been said or aren't or shouldn't be considered important. With this all then done, you move then on to the weighing of these rebutted arguments against everything else. So that is making sure to say which is the larger impact, which is the greatest impact, which is the impact on the greatest number of people, and which is the more morally relevant or principally significant argumentation impact that we should care more about. With all this done, this is a very useful. This is a pretty useful way to go about dealing with rebuttal, to go about rebutting arguments or rebutting cases. I hope it's something that people watching this either on the live stream or via video have found useful. Again, if you've got any questions, feel free to either get in touch with me. You can find me on Facebook, Owen Mooney, just as it's spelled in the title of the stream or the video, or just to contact Orgcom Scotland directly, and they'll definitely be able to pass my contact details on to you. But yep, that is everything I was wanting to talk about here. So if you've got any further questions, please do get in touch. And thank you all very much for watching. Goodbye.